Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm honored to testify about EPA's proposed CO2 power plant regulations. I've submitted my full written statement for the record. EPA's proposal raises grave constitutional questions, exceeds EPA's statutory authority, and violates the Clean Air Act. First, the plan conflicts with settled principles of federalism and Supreme Court precedent because it would commandeer state governments, treating them more like marionettes dancing to the tune of a federal puppeteer than like laboratories of democracy. It would dictate the CO2 emissions target that each state must adopt within a year, commanding every state to enact an EPA-approved package of laws meeting that target by requiring power plants to shut down or reduce operations, consumers and businesses to use less electricity and pay more for it, and utilities to shift from coal to natural gas and other energy sources, a total overhaul of the state's way of life. Now, reducing states to this submissive role would confound the political accountability that the 10th Amendment guarantees. EPA's plan would increase energy costs over local opposition while cloaking that increase in the emperor's garb of state choice, with state governments taking the blame for policies actually dictated and necessitated by EPA. A state that submits no plan meeting EPA's approval by 2016 confronts a centrally planned and administered federal scheme of uncertain scope, burdening the state and its citizens, backed by draconian sanctions like the loss of federal funds under pre-existing anti-pollution programs. Prominent defenders of the EPA's proposal necessarily concede that non-complying states gambling on whatever unpredictable backup plan EPA might impose would be at a huge disadvantage. EPA's proposal also presents serious Fifth Amendment problems. We are all CO2 emitters, and atmospheric CO2 is the intermingled result of all human activity. But EPA would impose costs that ought to be borne equitably by everyone on a small group of power plants and companies after requiring those same companies to invest billions of dollars to reduce their non-CO2 pollutants over the past 25 years. The Constitution demands just compensation to rectify that bait and switch. Now, courts would never assume a congressional design to confer such revolutionary and constitutionally dubious power on EPA unless Congress clearly said so, but far from it. Under the very Clean Air Act provision that EPA invokes, Section 111D, Congress expressly prohibited EPA from doing exactly what it proposes to do here, regulate emissions from coal-fired power plants under Section 111D when those same power plants are already being regulated in costly ways under Section 112. In 1995, EPA itself read the Clean Air Act to prohibit such duplication, as did the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals in 2008 and the U.S. Supreme Court in 2011. If the Clean Air Act's meaning were ambiguous, and it isn't, settled principles of statutory interpretation would mean that EPA and any reviewing court would have to interpret the Act to avoid the constitutional difficulties that EPA's interpretation raises under the Fifth and 10th Amendments. Now, to circumvent that avoidance principle, EPA resorts to sheer fantasy. It claims that Congress enacted a law in 1990 that never made it into the U.S. Code, and that everybody has been using the wrong version of the statute for the past quarter century. Really? Crediting that story would call into question dozens of similar statutory provisions throughout the U.S. Code. The tale is pure fiction. There is no mistake in the U.S. Code, but even if Congress had truly tossed two different bills in the air and told EPA to decide which one to catch and run with, that would be a power Congress could not give away and EPA could not recognize and exercise. It is a lawmaking power that belongs only to you, backed by a judicial power that belongs only to the courts. EPA is attempting an unconstitutional trifecta, usurping the prerogatives of the states, Congress and the federal courts all at once. Much is up for grabs in this complex area, but burning the Constitution of the United States, about which I care deeply, cannot be part of our national energy policy to deal with the problems of climate change. Thank you very much.